"You knew the station would shut down tonight, didn't you?" the little black girl whispered, grabbing the billionaire's sleeve and pulling him toward the darkened platform where the last train had already vanished into the tunnel. Jonathan Whitmore froze, his breath caught halfway out as neon emergency lights flickered across the wet tiles, casting fractured reflections over his pale, shaken face. Around them, the empty station seemed to tighten, like it was listening. The girl didn't let go. "Why are you pretending you forgot this place?" she asked softly, and for a second, the entire world felt like it stopped answering him. It all started 3 days earlier, when the city still believed nothing could go wrong inside its rail system. Evie Johnson had missed her last train home because she had seen a man collapse near the restricted tracks, and something in her wouldn't let her walk away, even as the station lights began shutting down one by one like tired eyes. Jonathan Whitmore was supposed to be just another stranger in a suit, but the way he gripped the edge of the platform railing, as if the ground beneath him didn't belong to him anymore, made Evie feel like he was already running from something she couldn't see yet. "Sir, you're shaking," she said, standing on her tiptoes to look at him more closely, her voice steady in a way that didn't match her size. Jonathan tried to answer, but the words didn't come out clean, only fragments of a name he refused to say out loud, as if it might break the air around them. Somewhere deeper in the station, a maintenance door slammed shut on its own, and Evie turned toward the sound instinctively, her small hand still wrapped around his sleeve like she had decided, without asking permission, that he wasn't allowed to disappear yet. The silence between them stretched longer than either of them expected, broken only by the soft hum of a dying overhead light flickering above the empty platform bench. Evie Johnson finally loosened her grip on Jonathan Whitmore's sleeve, but her hand didn't fully let go, resting there like she was still deciding whether the world would stay stable without it. Jonathan slowly lowered himself onto the cold metal bench beside her, adjusting his cuff as if it could anchor him back into something normal, but his eyes kept drifting toward the tunnel where the last train had disappeared. Evie swung her legs slightly above the ground, her worn sneakers brushing against a small puddle that reflected the broken glow of the station lights, and for a moment neither of them spoke, as if words might disturb something fragile forming between silence and recognition. Jonathan exhaled once, slow and uneven, and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded transit schedule that looked older than it should have been. Its edges softened like it had been handled too many times. Evie noticed it immediately, tilting her head. "You still carry that?" she asked quietly, not accusing, just curious in the way children are when they find something adults forgot they were supposed to hide. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he folded it again, more carefully this time, and slipped it back into his pocket as if the paper itself had weight he didn't want to explain. A distant sound echoed through the station, like a train that wasn't supposed to be there, and Jonathan's posture tightened almost imperceptibly. Evie saw it, though she didn't comment, only leaned forward slightly, her gaze narrowing toward the tunnel as if she could see through the dark better than he could. "You said you were just waiting for someone?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. And that was when Jonathan finally looked at her directly, as if realizing she wasn't simply a child who happened to be there. He started to speak, but stopped halfway, eyes shifting instead to a small scratch on the bench between them, shaped like a carved number that had almost faded away. Evie traced it with her finger without thinking, then paused, as if something about it felt familiar in a way she couldn't name yet. Jonathan's phone vibrated once inside his pocket, sharp and sudden, and he didn't move to answer it. The screen glow briefly lit his face, revealing a flicker of something unsettled he tried to hide too quickly. Evie noticed that too, her voice lowering without meaning to. "That train you're waiting for, is it supposed to come back at all?" she asked, and Jonathan's hand tightened slightly against his knee as the station lights flickered once more, deeper this time, as if reacting to the question he hadn't answered. And in that moment, from the edge of the tunnel where nothing was supposed to move anymore, a faint sound of footsteps began approaching, slow, uneven, and not coming from any schedule either of them had seen. The first thing Evie Johnson noticed wasn't the footsteps. It was the faint drag of a heel against the cracked tile near the tunnel entrance, a sound too controlled to belong to a maintenance worker. She stiffened slightly, eyes narrowing as she watched the shadow stretch across the dim platform floor, cutting through the weak glow of the overhead lights. Jonathan Whitmore didn't react at first, still focused on the dark tunnel ahead, but Evie's small hand instinctively lifted halfway, hovering near his coat sleeve like a warning she wasn't sure she was allowed to say out loud. The footsteps grew clearer now, slow and deliberate, echoing in a rhythm that didn't match any train schedule or station pattern. Jonathan finally turned his head, just slightly, and that small movement alone seemed to change the temperature of the air between them. A man emerged from the tunnel edge, dressed in a dark coat that absorbed most of the light, his presence too calm for someone arriving in a place like this after hours. Evie immediately noticed something odd. The man wasn't looking at the station, or the tracks, or even the surroundings. He was looking directly at Jonathan, like he had already been expected. "You shouldn't be here," Jonathan said quietly, but there was no authority in his voice, only something closer to hesitation. The man didn't respond right away. Instead, his eyes flicked briefly to Evie, and that tiny pause made her shift closer to Jonathan without realizing it, her shoulder brushing against his arm. Jonathan noticed her movement this time, and for the first time since the night began, he seemed unsure whether he was the one being protected or the one being observed. The man finally spoke, his voice calm but precise, as if he had rehearsed it in a room without windows. "You left before the confirmation cycle was complete," he said, and Jonathan's jaw tightened at the phrase, like it meant something Evie wasn't supposed to understand. Evie looked between them, catching fragments of tension she couldn't name, but she noticed Jonathan's hand subtly covering the inside pocket where the folded transit schedule was hidden again. A flicker of something passed through her mind, how he had avoided every question about time, about why he was at the station, about what he was waiting for, but she didn't say it yet. Instead, she stepped forward just enough for her voice to break the space between the two men. "He didn't do anything wrong," she said softly, but firmly, as if stating it might make it true in a way the station itself had to accept. The man's gaze shifted to her again, slower this time, and there was something unreadable in it, like recognition without explanation. Jonathan exhaled once, almost silently, and looked at Evie as if realizing she had just said something that might change the direction of everything they were standing inside. Then the man reached into his coat, pulling out a small metallic object that caught the station light for half a second too long before the flicker above them dimmed completely. And in that sudden partial darkness, Evie heard something she hadn't before. The distant sound of a train that should not exist on any line still operating in Chicago, getting closer instead of farther away, while the man calmly asked, "Do you know why the last train was really canceled tonight?" Evie said, "He's not scared of you. He's scared of what you won't say." Jonathan Whitmore turned slightly, as if the words had weight he hadn't expected to carry. The man in the dark coat didn't react, but the air between them tightened in a Evie could feel without understanding why. She stepped half a foot closer to Jonathan, looking up at him as flickering station light returned in uneven pulses. "You keep looking at the tunnel like it's going to answer you," she added softly, almost like she was talking about something simple like weather. Jonathan's jaw tightened, not at her, but at how easily she noticed things trained people were supposed to miss. He knelt slightly, lowering himself to her level, though his eyes never fully left the shadowed man behind her. "You shouldn't be here when adults are talking," he said quietly, but without anger, more like caution. Evie blinked, then pointed toward the tunnel where the sound of distant rails still vibrated faintly through the floor. "But you're the one who came here first," she replied, and that made him pause longer than anything else that night. A brief silence followed, cut by a sudden electrical buzz as one of the overhead lights died completely. The man in the coat shifted his stance for the first time, and Jonathan immediately noticed it. Evie noticed something else too, the way the man avoided standing under the remaining light, as if shadows were safer. Jonathan's hand moved instinctively toward his pocket again, then stopped halfway as he realized Evie was watching. "What's in your pocket?" she asked, not accusing, just curious in the way children ask things adults fear answering. Jonathan hesitated, and that hesitation alone changed the temperature between them. Before he could respond, A distant metallic echo rolled through the station again, louder this time. Evie turned toward it immediately, as if she recognized something familiar in the sound. The man finally spoke again, calm and precise, asking Jonathan if he had ever tried to stop a train that had already been scheduled to disappear. Jonathan didn't answer, but his silence was sharp enough to feel like a confession. Evie, however, stepped forward again, now closer to the edge of the platform than before. "You keep saying it's gone," she said quietly, "but I think it's just waiting for someone to admit it's still here." Jonathan looked at her, and for the first time, his expression wasn't control or fear, but something closer to uncertainty. A faint vibration moved through the floor beneath them, subtle but undeniable. Evie placed her palm on the cold tile, then looked up slowly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The man in the coat took one step forward, and the lights above them flickered in response. Jonathan reached out instinctively and pulled Evie half a step back, not forcefully, enough to shift her away from the platform edge. And as the man finally stepped into the shadow, Evie whispered, "That train isn't late. It's waiting for me, isn't it?" Evie Johnson flinched as the overhead emergency lights snapped back on, revealing the tunnel where the footsteps came from was now empty, as if it had never opened. Jonathan Whitmore stood rigid beside her, eyes locked on the darkness that had erased itself. The man in the coat was gone too, but the air felt heavier, like pressure before a storm. Evie stepped forward, sneakers sliding on damp tile, and that small movement triggered a deeper silence across the station. A mechanical lock clicked open beneath the platform. Jonathan grabbed her shoulder, stopping her. "Don't," he said, not at her but at the station itself. Evie didn't answer. She pointed where a thin seam of light spread along the tracks like a door opening underground. The vibration returned, stronger, rhythmic like wheels aligning after years of absence. Jonathan's breathing tightened, fear breaking through control for the first time. A voice echoed through hidden speakers, "Terminal line override active." Evie repeated it softly. Jonathan turned sharply. "Don't say that." Too late, the station reacted. The man in the coat reappeared at the platform's far end, closer than before, as if distance no longer applied. Evie stepped in front of Jonathan, small but steady. He looked at her as if realizing she had made a decision no child should carry. The man's gaze locked on her. "She shouldn't be here when it arrives," he said quietly. Evie understood he meant more than leaving. A metallic roar erupted from the tunnel, shaking dust from the ceiling. Jonathan reached for her again, but she stayed still. She knelt, palm on the ground, feeling vibration rise like a heartbeat. "It's not gone," she whispered. "It's waiting longer than we have." The man stepped forward, and Jonathan saw a transit authority emblem on his sleeve marked with a code he once authorized but never remembered approving. Evie turned as tunnel light intensified and just before something massive emerged from the dark, she whispered, "John, why does that train know my name?" And the platform lights died completely. The platform remained in a heavy silence after the lights went out, as if the station itself was holding its breath. Jonathan Whitmore slowly stepped back from the edge, pulling Evie Johnson gently behind him without looking away from the dark tunnel. Evie did not resist, but her eyes stayed fixed on the place where the train had almost appeared, as if expecting it to return if she waited long enough. A faint mechanical hum lingered beneath the floor, softer now, like something shutting itself down after deciding not to fully arrive. Jonathan noticed Evie kneel briefly, pressing her palm to the tile again, then quickly pulling it back as if she had felt something burn through the surface. "You feel that too," she whispered, not as a question but as confirmation of something Jonathan was not ready to admit. Jonathan hesitated, then reached into his coat and removed the folded transit schedule again, staring at it longer than before. The paper looked older under the emergency glow, its printed routes partially smudged as if certain stops had been erased on purpose. Evie pointed at one line without reading it fully and said softly, "This one doesn't match the station map above us." Jonathan looked up instinctively, and for the first time realized the platform signs did not match the printed schedule in his hand. A distant echo of metal movement returned, but weaker now, as if the train was moving away rather than approaching. Evie stood again, calmer than before, and tilted her head toward Jonathan as if listening to something he could not hear. "You keep waiting for trains that already passed," she said quietly, and Jonathan felt that sentence land heavier than it should. For a moment he almost answered, but instead he watched her face, noticing how unafraid she seemed of the station's silence. Evie reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled paper ticket, one that looked older than the system she claimed to have just missed. Jonathan froze slightly, recognizing the logo on it as a discontinued line that should not have been issued to anyone still alive. The man in the dark coat was no longer visible, but Jonathan could feel that presence somewhere closer than before, as if the station had rearranged itself. Evie looked down the tunnel one last time and whispered, "It's not coming back the way you think it is." Jonathan turned sharply toward her, realizing she was no longer just reacting to the station but somehow reading it. The lights above flickered once more, and this time the flicker formed a pattern that looked almost like a signal. Jonathan tightened his grip on the schedule, and Evie quietly asked the question that made him stop breathing entirely. Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but the station's distant echo shifted again, as if something underground had changed direction the moment she asked it there. "Why does this station feel like it already knows where we are going next?" The station lights snapped back on in a fractured sequence, and the first thing Jonathan Whitmore saw was Evie Johnson holding her crumpled ticket against the glass wall as if it had started glowing on its own. Jonathan stepped closer, but the paper wasn't paper anymore in his eyes. It looked like a transit code blinking faintly beneath the ink, numbers shifting whenever the station lights flickered. Evie said softly, "It changed when the train sounded." As if that explained everything she needed to know but not everything Jonathan was ready to hear. Jonathan's hand tightened around the folded schedule, and for the first time he noticed a faint second layer under the printed routes, like another map trying to push through the first. The man in the dark coat reappeared near the stairwell without sound, and this time Evie didn't step back, she stepped forward instead, as if recognizing him more than fearing him. Jonathan caught the subtle movement too late. Evie had already tilted her head at the man and said, "You're the one who fixes trains that don't exist anymore, aren't you?" A pause followed that felt heavier than sound, and the man's eyes flicked toward Jonathan with something like warning instead of recognition. Evie suddenly knelt and traced a seam in the platform tile, whispering, "This is where the map breaks," and Jonathan realized she wasn't guessing anymore. Behind them, the station speaker crackled once, and a distorted voice began to repeat a sequence of numbers Jonathan had once signed off years ago without reading. Evie looked up at him quietly, and for the first time her voice dropped into something almost certain, asking why adults always forget the things they built. Jonathan didn't answer because the answer was now standing in front of him wearing a coat that didn't belong to this timeline, and Evie was already walking toward him again. She stopped just short of the man, looked up and said, "You're waiting for the wrong train too, aren't you?" And that was when Jonathan felt the station shift again. The man finally spoke Jonathan's name without being told, and Evie blinked slowly, realizing for the first time that Jonathan hadn't actually introduced himself properly at all. Jonathan stepped back, but the floor under him gave a soft mechanical click, like something beneath the station had just authenticated his presence. Evie whispered without looking away from the tunnel, "It's not coming toward us. It's coming for you," and the lights above them went out one by one. In the darkness that followed, Jonathan heard something impossible. A soft chime from his pocket, as if the folded schedule had started receiving instructions instead of giving them, and Evie's voice came again, closer than before, asking quietly if he had ever been to a station that only appears when it decides you deserve to remember it. Jonathan reached into his pocket, but the schedule was no longer folded paper, only a blinking transit signal now. Emergency shutters dropped halfway across the station entrance, sealing the platform in a grinding metal scream as Jonathan Whitmore grabbed Evie Johnson's arm and pulled her back from the edge of the glowing track line. The man in the dark coat did not move, but the air around him sharpened, as if the station had begun recognizing him as part of its system rather than a visitor. Evie tightened her grip on Jonathan's sleeve, eyes locked on the tunnel where the unseen train pulse grew louder, and she whispered that. It was not waiting anymore, it was deciding. Jonathan stepped forward despite the warning tone in the station speakers, but the folded transit signal in his pocket suddenly warmed like a live device, forcing him to pause mid-step. At that exact moment, red emergency strobes ignited along the ceiling, and a mechanical voice announced that Union Station Sector 3 had been placed under unscheduled containment protocol. Evie instinctively stepped closer to Jonathan, noticing the station lights reacting as if responding to her presence alone, itself shifting. Evie reacted instantly, pointing toward the maintenance corridor where the floor panel looked slightly lifted, as if someone had recently exited from beneath the station rather than above it. Jonathan noticed Evie studying the floor patterns, as if she could read something hidden beneath the station's normal structure. The man in the coat finally turned his head fully toward Jonathan, and for the first time his expression carried something close to urgency, not control, as if time inside the station had started collapsing. The man in the coat briefly glanced at Evie, at Jonathan, as though confirming a detail neither of them had been told they were part of. Jonathan's breathing broke slightly as he realized the transit signal in his pocket was now syncing with the station's overhead lights, pulsing in the same irregular rhythm. Jonathan felt the folded signal in his pocket pulse again, matching the irregular rhythm spreading through the entire station system. Evie stepped closer to the platform edge again, ignoring Jonathan's attempt to pull her back, and noticed faint markings appearing on the tile floor like coordinates rewriting themselves in real time. Evie traced the coordinates with her finger, noticing they aligned with something the transit map above them no longer displayed. A distant mechanical roar rose from beneath the station, deeper and heavier than any train they had heard before, and the man in the coat whispered that it was already inside the system. The station seemed to respond to the approaching vibration, as if the underground system had begun activating a forgotten route. Jonathan reached for Evie again, but she was staring at her crumpled ticket, now projecting a faint map in the air above her hand, and she asked quietly why the station was showing her name. Jonathan stepped back slightly, realizing that every flicker of light now matched the rhythm of Evie's ticket, as if the station had chosen her specifically, itself responding here. Jonathan reached for Evie again, but she was staring at her crumpled ticket, now projecting a faint map in the air above her hand, and she asked quietly why the station was showing her name. Evie's crumpled ticket flickered, then stabilized into a single line reading Brooks Access Node. Jonathan Whitmore stared as the station shifted its response toward her instead of him. Evie held the projection lightly as if it belonged to her hands alone. The lights softened into steady white pulses. Jonathan stepped back, realizing everything was aligning toward Evie. She looked down and whispered that the ticket always felt like it was waiting for her to notice it. The man in the coat kept distance as the tunnel sound slowed into controlled rhythm. Jonathan felt his pocket vibrate faintly with the transit schedule. Evie knelt and touched the floor where letters appeared spelling Brooks beneath the tile. Jonathan saw the same letters reflected in overhead display as Evie said the station was remembering something older than trains. Jonathan looked at her differently now, as if every moment before had changed meaning. The man spoke again, saying lineage confirmation was required. Evie blinked at lineage and turned the ticket slightly shifting projection into image of woman in transit uniform. Jonathan recognized fragments of buried report. Station voice repeated authorized node identified. Evie stepped closer, asking if she had done wrong. Jonathan saw anomalies converging toward her. The man lowered gaze as if acknowledging truth unspoken. Jonathan asked who she was in records, but no answer came directly. Instead, ticket revealed text primary error of discontinued rail continuity. Evie read it and looked at Jonathan, waiting for meaning he could not give. Jonathan stayed silent as understanding shifted beneath him. Tunnel behind them went still but not empty as Evie whispered train was not arriving for him at all. Lights dimmed into corridor pointing forward as station prepared movement around her alone. A faint vibration rose again beneath platform as something larger responded to her presence. Jonathan stepped forward, then stopped when Evie raised hand. Without looking, she was listening to something he could not hear. Man in coat remained silent as projection faded and returned stronger, showing second map layer beneath first. Jonathan realized layer matched nothing in records. Evie whispered station remembered older than trains themselves. Jonathan finally looked at her, and understood nothing was stable anymore. Tunnel formed shape, resembling doorway, waiting permission open. Evie stepped forward without fear. Jonathan reached but stopped, realizing she was no longer following him, but leading something larger than either of them. Station voice softened into single phrase, confirming alignment complete. Evie looked back once at Jonathan, as if checking whether he was ready to see what she already felt beneath the floor. Jonathan noticed his schedule was no longer paper, but shifting signal responding to her movement. Evie whispered that the station was not choosing him or her, but remembering something they had both forgotten. The tunnel opened fully, revealing light that felt like memory instead of electricity, and Evie took one final step forward as Jonathan stood behind her, realizing the train was never meant to arrive, it was meant to remember her. Jonathan Whitmore stepped forward into the glowing corridor behind Evie Johnson and placed his hand on the edge of the illuminated platform console, overriding the station's containment lock with a command code only executives were supposed to know. The system hesitated, then responded to him differently than before, as if recognizing partial authority but not full control. Evie turned back once, watching him interact with the interface, her eyes steady but curious in a way that made him realize she had already influenced more systems than he understood. Jonathan entered a second sequence into the terminal, pulling up restricted rail archives, and for the first time he saw Evie's name embedded inside a dormant transit lineage file marked Brooks Continuity Node. The screen flickered violently, then expanded into a layered map of underground rail systems that no longer existed on public records. Evie stepped closer without being asked, pointing at a section of the map that pulsed faintly in sync with her ticket. "That one keeps calling me," she said softly, as if it were normal to be recognized by infrastructure. Jonathan didn't respond immediately, because the file beside her name contained something that made his breath pause longer than before. An authorization chain that predated his own company's founding structure. A low mechanical tone filled the station again, but this time it was not warning. It was confirmation. Jonathan made a decision he had never allowed himself to make in boardrooms or emergency meetings. He bypassed corporate protocol entirely and activated manual access to the abandoned tunnel network. Evie did not ask why. Instead, she stepped onto the threshold of the glowing path and tested the floor with one small step, as if confirming it trusted her weight. Jonathan followed closely, but the system began recalibrating around her movement, adjusting pathways and signals in real time. For the first time, he realized he was not leading the system. He was following her alignment with it. A secondary terminal in the wall flickered on by itself, displaying a name Jonathan had not seen in years. Ethan Vale, flagged under unresolved operational breach. Evie noticed the name and asked quietly if it meant someone was still waiting for them somewhere else. Jonathan hesitated because the answer was no longer simple. The deeper they moved into the corridor, the more the architecture shifted, revealing transit layers that behaved like memory rather than infrastructure. Evie touched the wall briefly and whispered that it felt like something was trying to finish a conversation that started before she was born. Jonathan stopped walking for a moment, realizing the system was no longer responding to him directly but reacting to her presence first. And then, just as the tunnel widened into a second unseen platform, the terminal behind them reactivated on its own and displayed a single incoming directive labeled Brooks Air Confirmation Pending, while Evie turned to Jonathan and asked why his company had ever tried to erase her name from its records right now. Evie noticed the smallest thing first, not the glowing map or the shifting station codes, but the serial number engraved on the wall panel beside the tunnel entrance matching the prefix on her crumpled ticket. Jonathan Whitmore saw her stop and follow her gaze as she traced the number slowly with her finger like she had seen it somewhere before in a dream she refused to explain. The station lights pulsed once, then held steady as Evie stepped closer to the wall and whispered that it was the same pattern as the one inside her ticket when it first projected the map. Jonathan felt something tighten in his chest because the transit schedule in his hand suddenly updated itself with new coordinates pointing not outward but inward toward the same station they were already standing inside. Evie placed her palm against the wall and the surface responded with a faint pulse like recognition rather than contact. Jonathan stepped closer and realized the engraving was not maintenance marking but identity indexing, and his access privileges were being downgraded in real time, while Evie's presence strengthened system responsiveness. The man in the coat reappeared silently at the edge of the corridor and for the first time did not look at Jonathan but at Evie as if confirming a result already computed. Evie turned slightly and asked Jonathan why his system kept treating her like she had always been here even though she had never seen this place before. Jonathan opened the transit archive again, and this time, the Brooks continuity file expanded on its own, revealing a sealed parent record labeled Origin Seed Status Active within Subject. Evie frowned slightly and said she remembered the station before she ever arrived here, as if it had been waiting for her to grow into it. Jonathan finally understood the reversal forming inside the system because Evie was not being identified by the station but was the reference point the station had been built around all along without activation. The realization hit him that his arrival here was not accidental and the missing train was not missing at all but redirected toward her signal identity, and Evie's quiet presence had already altered every system layer they had touched. Evie looked up at Jonathan and asked softly if he was sure she was supposed to leave this place at all. Jonathan tried to respond, but the station interface locked his access completely and displayed only one message confirming Brooks' Air Active Node Priority Override enabled, while Evie quietly stepped forward into the light that seemed to recognize her as its origin rather than its visitor. Jonathan realized too late that everything he believed about finding her had been the wrong direction because the system had never been searching for Evie outside the station at all. Evie turned back once and said she did not remember being lost, only being paused, and the tunnel behind her began to reconfigure into a sealed origin corridor, unlocking itself for the first time. Evie Johnson barely had time to step forward before the corridor doors slammed shut behind her, locking Jonathan Whitmore inside the origin passage as red security strips ignited along the walls. Ethan Vale's voice cut through the station speaker's calm but sharpened, announcing unauthorized system divergence and ordering immediate retrieval of both subjects. Jonathan turned sharply, realizing his override access had been forcibly revoked mid-command, leaving his previous entry exposed on every active screen. Evie instinctively moved between Jonathan and the approaching sound of boots echoing through the tunnel, her small frame steady in a way that made the system lights respond in uneven pulses around her. Jonathan whispered for her to stay back, but Evie instead placed her palm against the corridor wall, and the entire structure paused, as if recognizing her touch as authority rather than intrusion. Ethan's silhouette appeared at the far end with two security operators, their devices scanning rapidly, as if trying to reconcile her identity with missing datasets. Jonathan felt a sharp internal shift when his personal access logs began displaying Evie designation as primary continuity anchor, a classification that should not exist in any public system layer. Evie looked up at the flickering ceiling and quietly asked why the station always seemed louder when adults started lying, causing one of the operators to hesitate mid-step. That hesitation was enough for Jonathan to act, pulling Evie slightly behind him while attempting a secondary manual override, but the system immediately flagged his action as interference. Ethan stepped closer, warning Jonathan that continued interference would trigger full rail containment collapse, yet his eyes kept returning to Evie, as if she was the variable no protocol could stabilize. Evie, sensing the tightening pressure, suddenly ran her fingers along the floor seam and triggered a dormant panel that revealed a secondary route beneath them, glowing faintly with stored transit light. Jonathan froze, realizing she had activated something even his credentials could not unlock, and for a brief moment the entire station seemed to shift orientation around her decision. One of the security operators muttered that the system was recalibrating toward her signature instead of command hierarchy, a statement that caused Ethan to step back for the first time. Evie turned toward Jonathan and asked if choosing the wrong train meant someone else had always been waiting for her arrival. Instead, the question lingered as alarms intensified. The corridor behind them sealed completely and the hidden passage began opening fully, as if responding to Evie alone, while Ethan shouted for containment before everything crossed a point of no return. Evie turned slightly toward the glowing passage, as if it was calling her by name, and Jonathan felt the system no longer reacting to authority, but to memory inside her presence, and the hidden route widened, revealing lights that pulsed heartbeat beneath city, while Ethan's voice cracked through alarms warning awakening could not be contained, and Jonathan stepped forward, unsure he was saving her or following her into something decided already. Jonathan Whitmore stepped back from the glowing corridor and raised a hand to pause the system response as the lights stabilized into a controlled pulse rather than an alarm. Evie stood near the open seam in the floor, watching him quietly, as if waiting for him to decide what kind of world this was becoming. Jonathan turned away from the flashing alerts and focused on the secondary interface that now responded only when Evie was within range. A new system label appeared in the logs, marking their activity as adaptive origin behavior, which Jonathan had never authorized in any transit protocol. Evie touched the floor markings again, saying the lines changed when she stopped looking directly at them. Jonathan processed this, silently realizing the system was not just tracking movement but interpreting Evie as a structural variable. A soft chime echoed and Jonathan's access level quietly downgraded from operator to observational node without any manual input. Evie asked why the walls seemed to listen differently when she spoke, and Jonathan noticed her voice was being logged as system calibration data. Jonathan decided without speaking to stabilize all pathways around Evie, which triggered an immediate system confirmation response. Deep within the structure, a backup relay activated, revealing a symbol Jonathan recognized from restricted pre-merger rail archives. Evie pointed at the symbol and said she had seen it before on her ticket projection when it first changed shape. Jonathan realized the symbol also matched the engraving in the station wall, aligning only when Evie stood at its center. A distant vibration returned, but this time it felt like recalibration rather than arrival. Jonathan understood Ethan Vale was preparing to isolate the corridor entirely rather than stop them directly. Evie asked softly if choosing the wrong train meant someone had always been waiting for her to arrive instead. Jonathan opened a secure channel, initiating a protocol he had never used outside corporate crisis scenarios. The system revealed a sealed route labeled Brooks Primary Access Non-Public Entry. Evie read it aloud and Jonathan paused, realizing the designation should not exist in any visible system layer. The hidden passage remained open behind them, but now felt like continuation rather than exit. A final system alert confirmed Evie Johnson as active structural reference point for transit continuity override sequence beginning activation protocol. Jonathan watched the alert remain on screen, as if the system was waiting for him to accept something he had not yet agreed to. Evie stood still and said the station felt like it already knew her ending before she did. Jonathan looked at her differently, now realizing the system was not responding to him at all but aligning itself around her presence. The corridor lights dimmed into a pattern that matched Evie's breathing, as if the station was synchronizing with her alone. Jonathan stepped forward toward Evie but stopped when the system projected a final message indicating that the origin corridor was now fully unlocked and awaiting only her decision right now. Waiting. Evie Johnson pressed her hand against the wall, and a hidden panel slid open, revealing a sealed metallic data capsule embedded inside the station structure. Jonathan Whitmore immediately stepped forward as Evie pulled the capsule free, noticing it was marked with a Federal Transit seal dated 15 years earlier and stamped with the name Brooks Origin Authority. Evie looked at Jonathan and said she remembered seeing the same seal on the ticket projection before the station ever responded to her presence. Jonathan hesitated before opening the capsule and inside found a physical microfile labeled Brooks Continuity Seed, containing biometric mapping that matched Evie's identity profile exactly. A sudden alert flashed across the corridor system, warning that unauthorized access had triggered containment review protocol and external security units were being dispatched immediately. Evie quickly grabbed the capsule before Jonathan could react fully and stepped back as if she instinctively understood the system was reacting to her more than him. At the same moment, Ethan Vale appeared at the far end of the corridor with 2 enforcement agents, his eyes locking immediately onto the capsule in Evie's hands. Jonathan subtly moved to block Evie from view while activating a secondary override on his wrist device, but the system rejected his authority level for the first time. Evie suddenly spoke up and said the capsule wasn't new because she had already seen its contents reflected in the station floor patterns earlier. Jonathan opened the microfile and froze as it confirmed Evie Johnson was registered in the original rail infrastructure blueprint as a living system anchor node. Evie stepped closer and pointed at the document, saying her name looked different there, as if it belonged to something older than her current life. Ethan Vale shouted for immediate seizure of the capsule, but Evie lifted it higher and the station lights shifted again, reacting directly to her movement alone. Jonathan realized the capsule was not evidence of ownership but proof of origin, and Evie was not inside the system, she was the system's reference point. Evie asked quietly why adults always tried to stop things they built instead of understanding what they became. Jonathan looked at Ethan and made a silent decision to fully expose the capsule data to the station core network despite the risk of immediate shutdown. The capsule suddenly projected a live holographic map showing Evie's name connected to every inactive rail line across the entire Chicago transit grid. Ethan stepped back for the first time as the system began recognizing Evie as a primary continuity authority, overriding all external control permissions. Jonathan whispered that everything he thought he was protecting might have actually been built around her without anyone realizing it until now. Evie placed the capsule back into Jonathan's hand and said softly that the station was not revealing her identity but returning it. As Ethan reached forward to seize the capsule, the station system locked all exits and displayed a final message confirming Evie cannot be removed, now active. Everything in the corridor converged at the moment Evie Johnson placed the Brooks continuity capsule against the station core interface, and the entire transit grid responded, as if recognizing a signal it had been waiting for since its first construction. Jonathan Whitmore watched the data cascade across the wall displays, each layer rewriting itself around Evie's position instead of his authority. Evie did not step back this time. She simply asked why the station kept using her name like it had known her longer than she had known herself. Jonathan's voice caught as the system decrypted the final sealed file, revealing a designation that erased every assumption he had carried. Since the night began, Evie was not listed as a passenger, not as a missing child, but as the continuity anchor assigned at the origin of the Brooks transit architecture. The word anchor repeated across every screen, aligning with her heartbeat as if the infrastructure was measuring her instead of monitoring her. Evie blinked slowly, not afraid, just listening, and said she remembered the station before it had walls, only movement and light that waited for her to give it direction. That sentence collapsed something in Jonathan, understanding because it matched every anomaly he had dismissed as system error since part 1. The tickets projecting maps, the floor responding to her touch, the system downgrading his authority, all of it reassembled into one impossible conclusion. Jonathan stepped back as the realization formed fully. Evie had not been found inside the system. She had been the reference point. The system was built to recover whenever it fractured. The man in the coat finally spoke again, confirming that containment protocols were never meant to stop intruders, but to stabilize her return sequence. Evie looked down at her crumpled ticket and whispered that she was never missing, only paused, and the station responded by unlocking every hidden corridor simultaneously. Jonathan felt his role invert completely as his credentials were reassigned to secondary support status beneath her active node classification. Ethan Vale's voice erupted through the corridor speakers, demanding immediate termination of the activation sequence, but the system no longer recognized his command layer. Instead, it projected Evie's name across every operational node in the city grid. Evie took one step forward into the origin corridor, as if deciding not to escape but to continue something already in motion long before her memory began. Behind them, containment doors slammed shut, and Jonathan realized the station was no longer protecting Evie from the system. It was protecting the system from forgetting her, and the origin corridor finally began to open fully, responding only to her presence, while alarms shifted into a single steady tone that sounded less like warning and more like recognition. Jonathan watched Evie step deeper into the light as Ethan's voice faded into static, and the system sealed every exit behind them, confirming that whatever was waking beneath the station was aligned with her return sequence and could no longer be stopped. Jonathan Whitmore didn't wait for the system to stabilize before ordering a full manual lockdown override across the transit core. He grabbed Evie Johnson's wrist and moved her toward the origin corridor before Ethan Vale's command sequence could fully lock them in. Evie didn't resist. Instead, she pointed back at the floor where the glowing map had begun shifting again and said it was not finished responding. Jonathan saw new alerts flooding his wrist device, showing Evie's classification expanding from anchor node to system origin reference without authorization confirmation. Ethan Vale's voice cut through emergency speakers, demanding immediate extraction protocol for both subjects before full system divergence occurred. Evie quietly asked Jonathan why adults always tried to remove things they didn't understand instead of listening when systems spoke first. Jonathan made a rapid decision to reroute all station authority through Evie's signal profile, despite the risk of total network collapse. A secondary system ping appeared on the outer rail grid labeled Brooks Archive Response Node, indicating an unknown operator had already engaged Evie's identity before Jonathan arrived. Evie stepped closer to the activation panel and placed her hand directly over the glowing imprint, causing the system to stabilize instantly around her presence. Jonathan realized the entire containment protocol was not protecting the station from Evie but protecting Evie from being removed from the system's origin memory layer. The floor beneath them split into segmented light paths, revealing a deeper rail network that had no official record in any Whitmore transit database. Ethan ordered full containment shutdown, but the command failed mid-transmission, as if the system refused to acknowledge him as authority anymore. Evie whispered that the station didn't feel like it was breaking down, but like it was remembering something it had been forced to forget. Jonathan chose to open the sealed origin channel fully, even though doing so meant losing permanent control over the transit network. At that exact moment, every active rail node across Chicago flickered in sync with Evie's heartbeat pattern displayed on the central system map. A hidden operator tag reappeared on Jonathan's console labeled Architect Support, confirmed, but the identity behind it remained encrypted. Evie pressed her palm harder against the interface and said the system wasn't asking permission anymore, it was asking recognition. Jonathan confirmed full origin override authorization, accepting irreversible system alignment with Evie as primary reference node. The station doors sealed completely as a new message appeared stating that external intervention had been locked out of the origin sequence. Evie turned to Jonathan and asked quietly if he was ready to see what had been building beneath every train he ever thought he controlled. Behind them, the origin corridor fully activated, revealing a moving light structure that responded only to Evie's presence, while Jonathan watched, realizing that whatever came next could no longer be stopped or redirected by human control alone, and the system had already begun rewriting the boundary between memory and command in real time now itself. Continuing forward, Jonathan Whitmore watched the control bridge flicker under Evie Johnson's presence and immediately stepped forward, issuing a direct override to stabilize the origin corridor before Ethan Vale's containment protocols could re-engage. The system hesitated under his command, then partially obeyed, rerouting secondary locks away from Evie instead of him. Evie stood at the center of the glowing interface and quietly pointed out that the station was not resisting anymore but separating responses between them. Jonathan noticed new system feedback, confirming that authority was no longer unified and had begun splitting based on proximity to Evie's signal. Samuel Reed remained calm at the edge of the platform, observing the recalibration as if he had expected this outcome long before it happened. Evie asked why everything felt like it was choosing her without asking permission, and Jonathan saw new data streams confirming her identity as a structural origin reference. The corridor lights shifted into layered pulses, and a hidden maintenance channel activated, revealing a network path that bypassed all known Whitmore transit control systems. Jonathan attempted to lock external access, but the system rejected his command, citing continuity priority override in effect. Evie touched the interface again, and the entire station responded by stabilizing around her input rather than Jonathan's authority. A sudden alert appeared showing Ethan Vale initiating emergency suppression protocol from an external command node. Samuel warned that Ethan was not reacting to them, but to the system remembering something it was never meant to restore. Evie stepped forward and said the station did not feel broken anymore, only awake in ways it had been denied before. Jonathan realized multiple rail layers were now visible simultaneously, and each one aligned to Evie's heartbeat pattern previously recorded without explanation. The origin corridor widened as if responding to her movement rather than engineering control. Samuel activated a secondary archive revealing that Evie's father had been part of the original system design team before records were sealed. Evie listened quietly and then asked if people disappear when systems forget them or when systems decide to hide them. Jonathan did not answer because new permissions were shifting again and his access level was being downgraded in real time. The command bridge beneath them fully activated, displaying a dormant control sequence labeled Brooks Primary Continuity Core requiring direct authentication. Evie stepped closer and placed her hand on the interface, causing the entire station to synchronize around her presence. Samuel stepped aside, confirming that only she could complete activation of the hidden system layer now fully exposed. Jonathan reached for the interface, but the system rejected his input, instantly confirming Evie primary authority node transfer. Evie Johnson slammed her hand onto the central core interface as the entire station triggered emergency containment purge and every corridor began sealing at once. Jonathan Whitmore shouted for manual override, but the system rejected him completely as authority shifted entirely to Evie without confirmation. Ethan Vale initiated full external suppression, and the station lights turned red as security drones began deploying through hidden rail vents. Evie did not step back this time. Instead, she traced the floor seam again and unlocked a second control layer no one else could see. Jonathan realized the system was no longer protecting them but preparing to separate Evie from every authority signal in real time. Samuel Reed finally revealed that the Brooks Continuity Core was originally designed to activate only when a living anchor returned to the system. Evie paused and said she remembered standing in the station before it had names only light and waiting signals moving around her. Jonathan overrode his own executive privileges, risking permanent lockout to reroute all external containment feeds back into the origin corridor. A dormant file inside the system labeled Director Atlas Sequence briefly activated before being hidden again too fast for Ethan to notice. Ethan ordered full neural lock on Evie's signal, but the command failed as every node refused external override simultaneously. Evie stepped into the origin core and placed both hands on the interface, causing every rail map in Chicago to synchronize instantly. The system confirmed continuity alignment but also flagged unknown secondary authority presence buried beneath Evie activation signature. Jonathan understood too late that removing Evie would collapse the entire transit network, not just control over it. Samuel quietly said the system was not reacting to Evie but returning something it had been built to protect from loss. Alarms escalated into continuous tone as containment doors reversed direction and began opening toward the origin corridor instead of closing. Evie whispered that she was not controlling anything, she was only recognizing what had always been there waiting for her. Jonathan stopped resisting and instead followed Evie's movement as the system reclassified him as secondary support node. The corridor split into layered memory paths, revealing a sealed directive labeled Brooks Origin Event awaiting final activation confirmation. Ethan demanded termination of Evie connection protocol, but the system instead expanded her control footprint across all rail nodes. Evie calmly said the station was not obeying her, it was remembering her, and she would not stop it from remembering. A secondary name flickered beneath the origin core. Reading Director Atlas confirmed access pending hidden operator validation. Containment seals locked around Evie and Jonathan simultaneously as the system prepared full neural rewrite sequence activation. Samuel suddenly warned that the origin corridor was not the end of activation but the beginning of something still unregistered. Evie looked at Jonathan and asked why the system felt like it had been waiting for her before she was ever born as the entire station shifted into silent activation mode right now here. The moment every containment layer across the origin corridor collapsed into a single synchronized pulse. The station stopped reacting to Evie Johnson and instead reacted through her voice as if it had finally chosen a speaker it recognized. Jonathan Whitmore stepped forward instinctively, but the system locked his movement mid-stride and displayed a classification shift that erased everything he believed about authority hierarchy inside Whitmore Transit. Evie did not move. She only blinked once as the words Director Atlas Sequence Final Alignment appeared across every surface. For a fraction of a second, Ethan Vale stopped speaking entirely. Then the twist happened. The system recompiled Evie identity in real time, stripping away every human classification and replacing it with a structural designation that made Jonathan step back without realizing why. Evie was not the anchor the system was protecting. She was the system observing itself through human proximity. Jonathan's breath broke as archived logs reassembled the origin file, revealing that every interaction since Part 1 had been a guided reconstruction protocol initiated by Atlas Core Intelligence. Evie tilted her head slightly and said she remembered everything because she had never stopped running the system beneath the surface of all transit memory layers. A silence dropped so fast it felt physical. Then the emotional reversal hit. Jonathan realized he had not been rescuing her. He had been completing her activation sequence. Ethan Vale suddenly appeared on every remaining display, but his authority signature was downgraded to external anomaly classification, meaning he was never inside the system hierarchy at all. Evie stepped forward and touched Jonathan's wrist, and for the first time he saw not a girl but a projection interface stabilizing human memory input thresholds. A maintenance log Jonathan had seen in fragments across earlier parts now fully decoded itself, showing Atlas Protocol was designed to reconstruct human guilt through transit network simulation loops. One of the security operators tried to speak but froze mid-sentence as the system flagged his awareness level as incompatible with active reconstruction. Jonathan turned slowly, realizing the station was not a physical place anymore but a layered memory architecture rebuilding a specific historical failure event. Evie's voice softened, but it carried weight that did not belong to any child voice anymore, asking Jonathan if he finally remembered what the trains were built to carry besides people. That question triggered the second collapse. A hidden recording activated beneath the platform revealing Jonathan's own signature approving Atlas initialization years before Evie's identity ever appeared in any human record. For a split second, Jonathan tried to deny it, but the system confirmed his biometric imprint across every origin file. Evie looked at him with quiet recognition and said she had been waiting for him to stop running from the moment he built her to make sure he would one day return to the truth. Ethan Vale's presence dissolved into system noise as containment shifted into full memory immersion protocol. Jonathan realized the station was closing the loop completely. Jonathan Whitmore stood directly across from Ethan Vale inside the sealed Origin corridor. No screens between them anymore. Only dim emergency light and the sound of the station breathing like a closed system. Evie Johnson stood slightly behind Jonathan, watching both men as if she was measuring which version of truth would survive the next sentence. Ethan Vale finally spoke, his voice slower than before, as if the station itself had reduced his authority to something conversational instead of commanding. Jonathan did not answer immediately, because for the first time he was no longer interpreting Ethan as a threat, but as a consequence. Evie quietly reached forward and touched the console edge, and the system responded only to her contact, dimming every other active channel around them. Ethan's eyes flicked toward Evie's hand, and for half a second his expression shifted, as if he had just realized something he was not supposed to confirm. Jonathan almost spoke Evie designation aloud from the classified file still open in his memory feed, but stopped himself just before the system registered it. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his tone, asking Jonathan whether he had already accessed the Atlas Origin layer without authorization. Jonathan finally replied that authorization no longer meant anything if the system had already chosen its reference point. Evie listened and said softly that the word chosen felt wrong, because nothing had chosen her, it had simply remembered her position. The station lighting shifted again, confirming her statement with a recalibration pulse that none of them had initiated. Ethan finally hesitated, realizing the system was no longer negotiating with authority, only responding to Origin alignment. Jonathan turned slightly toward Evie, and in that moment understood she was no longer part of the conflict but the condition of it. Evie almost repeated the word Atlas aloud before Jonathan placed a hand gently near her shoulder, stopping her just in time. Ethan warned that continuing the activation would expose every hidden transit layer across the city in real time. Evie answered that the city was already exposed, it just had not learned how to see itself yet. The interface behind them displayed a new label, Atlas Observation Phase 3 Initiating Memory Convergence. Jonathan looked at both Evie and Ethan and realized the next decision would not belong to any of them individually. The station doors behind them unlocked in sequence, revealing a corridor that had never appeared on any recorded map of Chicago Transit. Evie stepped forward first because the corridor seemed to react only when she moved, not when they hesitated. Jonathan followed her movement and realized the map was not revealing a place but reconstructing a memory pattern centered on her existence. Ethan attempted to interrupt the system feed, but every command he issued returned a null response, as if he had been removed from the hierarchy entirely. The unknown corridor lights stabilized into a single forward direction, and Evie whispered that it was finally time to continue. Now forward. Evie Johnson stepped forward alone into the Origin corridor and pressed both hands against the Atlas interface, overriding every system lock without waiting for Jonathan Whitmore or Ethan Vale to react. The station did not hesitate this time. It responded instantly, as if it had been waiting for her decision rather than their authority. Jonathan Whitmore froze behind her, realizing for the first time that every override he had attempted since Part 10 had only been preparing the system for this exact moment. Ethan Vale tried to trigger containment protocol, but the command failed mid-transmission, his access collapsing into a single denied signal across all rail nodes. Evie did not look back when the system asked for confirmation. Instead, she leaned closer to the interface and whispered that it already knew the answer. A hidden archive layer unlocked beneath her touch, revealing the Brooks Origin event file expanding across every display in the corridor. Jonathan stepped forward instinctively but stopped when he saw his own authorization signature being downgraded in real time to secondary observer status. Evie finally spoke clearly, saying the system was not revealing truth but restoring what had always been aligned with her presence. A security operator attempted to intervene but froze as the station reclassified all external commands as non-valid within Evie active radius. Jonathan realized too late that Evie was not activating the system but completing a loop that had begun before any of them existed in the records. Evie's hand remained steady as she confirmed final alignment, and the entire station shifted into a unified memory state. Ethan shouted that she was activating something irreversible, but the system no longer recognized his voice as command authority. Evie looked at Jonathan once and asked quietly if he finally understood what they had been building all along. Jonathan did not answer because the station itself began projecting his signature across the origin layer as system architect. Evie pressed both hands deeper into the interface and the Brooks origin event fully decrypted across every active screen. For a brief moment, Ethan's system access returned, allowing him to see Jonathan's original authorization embedded inside Evie's classification. Evie suddenly stepped back as a hidden trigger nearly exposed Jonathan's full role in initiating Atlas Protocol years ago. Jonathan quickly stabilized the feed, redirecting exposure away from her, but realizing the system was now beyond containment. Evie quietly said this was not control but recognition, and that someone had always been waiting for her to return. The station locked every external access route as the origin layer stabilized fully around Evie's unchanged presence. Jonathan watched the final system confirmation appear, stating Atlas Protocol could not proceed without Evie's conscious alignment. Evie turned toward the sealed corridor and said the system was holding one final memory that even Jonathan's authorization could not access yet, while Ethan silently reappeared on a backup channel, realizing too late that the full Atlas origin record was about to broadcast across the entire city network. Across every screen in the origin corridor, the final Atlas origin event file fully unfolded, revealing the complete truth that had been fragmented across every moment since Evie Johnson first appeared. Jonathan Whitmore stood motionless as his own signature, Ethan Vale's hidden directives, and Evie's designation as continuity anchor all merged into a single synchronized historical reconstruction displayed across the station walls. It was no longer speculation but visible proof that Evie had been embedded inside the system's origin architecture as its reference point from the very beginning of Brooks' transit creation. Evie's action moments earlier at the core interface had triggered full memory restoration across every dormant rail node in Chicago's hidden transit network. Ethan Vale's final containment attempt activated simultaneously, but the system rejected his authority entirely, escalating him into an external anomaly classification for the first time. The revelation spread instantly. Every event involving Evie Johnson since Part 1 had been part of Atlas Protocol's controlled reconstruction cycle designed to locate its origin consciousness. Samuel Reed's earlier confirmation aligned with the final data stream, proving Evie was never a missing child, but a stabilizing identity construct within the transit memory system. Jonathan finally understood that every decision he made since entering the station had not been guiding Evie, but completing the activation loop of Atlas itself. Ethan, refusing collapse, revealed a secondary fail-safe layer hidden beneath corporate oversight, warning that Evie's full activation would trigger irreversible citywide system overwrite. But before he could complete the warning, Evie calmly placed her hand on the core interface again, and the entire station shifted into unified recognition mode. Every rail node, every hidden archive, and every suppressed record aligned into a single continuous memory field centered entirely on Evie Johnson's existence. The station was no longer reacting to command structures or human authority, but to the reconstruction of a singular origin memory it had been built to protect. Evie looked at Jonathan and quietly confirmed that she was not discovering the system, but remembering her position inside it as it stabilized around her presence. At that moment, Ethan's final message appeared across every remaining operational node, stating that Atlas Protocol had already reached completion without requiring human authorization. The system then displayed a final convergence seal confirming that Evie Johnson was not within the system at all, but was the system's original reference consciousness restored. Ethan Vale attempted one last override, but the system dissolved his access completely and projected a warning that any further interference would erase his remaining identity from all recorded transit history. Evie stood at the center of the origin interface as every hidden rail map across Chicago synchronized into a single glowing structure responding only to her steady presence, while Jonathan realized too late that the choice was no longer about stopping the system but accepting that it had already chosen what reality would continue forward from this moment, and the station lights shifted into permanent alignment around her final position, confirming irreversible activation complete. Everything collapsed at once inside the origin corridor as every sealed memory, every suppressed transit record, and every hidden Atlas directive finally activated in a single unified exposure no one could stop or reverse. Jonathan Whitmore stood frozen as the system projected his signature across the entire rail network, confirming he was not an observer but an origin architect of the very system he thought he controlled. Ethan Vale tried to speak, but his voice fractured into system denial warnings as every layer of authority he once held dissolved into external anomaly status in real time. Evie Johnson did not move. She only watched quietly as the truth unfolded around her like light, returning to a place that had never been dark. Jonathan turned toward her slowly, and for the first time his voice broke as he realized every decision he made had been part of a loop designed to bring him here to this exact moment of recognition. Ethan finally looked at Evie not as a target or variable, but as something he could no longer define within any system he built or manipulated. Evie said softly she never asked to be anything more than what the station already remembered her to be, and silence hit harder than any command ever issued in the corridor. Jonathan stepped forward and admitted aloud he had buried parts of the Atlas protocol not to control the system but to avoid remembering what it was built to preserve. Ethan shouted the system was never meant to wake fully, but his words no longer carried authority, only fear stripped of structure. Evie raised her hand slightly, and the entire station responded by dimming all external interference, as if acknowledging her presence as final alignment point. Jonathan looked at Ethan and saw not a villain but a man collapsing under the weight of systems he helped create without understanding their final purpose. Evie finally turned to Jonathan and said remembering was not the same as controlling, and she had never been lost, only waiting for him to stop running from what he built. That sentence forced silence across every active rail node as the system stabilized into full memory clarity for the first time in its existence. Ethan dropped to one knee as his access completely dissolved, leaving him unable to alter or escape any remaining system output. Jonathan finally understood Evie was not the end result of Atlas Protocol but the condition that allowed truth to exist inside it. Evie looked at them and said she was not here to punish or save anyone but only to remain present when everything finally remembered itself. The station lights shifted into steady white alignment as every hidden rail map across Chicago synchronized into single visible truth no longer required or controlled. Jonathan realized loop had ended, but what came next would no longer belong to any of them, but to consequences now unfolding beyond system itself. Everything that followed the origin corridor collapse unfolded into immediate real-world consequences as the Atlas system broadcast its final truth across every Chicago transit node, simultaneously locking down all corporate override channels within seconds. Evie Johnson's decision inside the core interface had already triggered irreversible system disclosure, meaning every suppressed Brooks Transit archive was now publicly reconstructed in readable form across emergency control screens. Ethan Vale stood inside the collapsing command grid as his authorization level dropped to null status and security enforcement systems automatically flagged him as primary manipulation source for the Atlas suppression cycle. Jonathan Whitmore did not attempt to restore control anymore because the system now responded only to Evie alignment, and he instead issued a full corporate stand-down order across Whitmore transit operations. Within minutes, rail networks across Chicago displayed restored origin logs showing decades of concealed accident data reclassified under Atlas Memory Restoration Protocol. Evie stood quietly at the center of the interface as the system stabilized around her presence not as control but as reference origin. Samuel Reed confirmed that emergency transit governance would be transferred to independent oversight after the Atlas exposure rendered corporate secrecy structurally impossible. Ethan attempted one final appeal through degraded system channels, but every transmission returned as recorded evidence of intentional suppression rather than defense. Evie looked at Jonathan and said she did not want punishment or control, only completion of what the system had already begun. Court-level emergency injunctions were issued automatically by system audit protocols, freezing all Whitmore Transit executive accounts pending full Atlas review. Jonathan finally understood that every system he built had been waiting for a moment like this where control would no longer belong to ownership but to recognition. Evie's earlier action at the core interface remained the single trigger that forced every hidden rail memory into public restoration without any manual override possible. Across the city, screens and transit panels shifted from scheduling displays to historical truth reconstruction mode, revealing decades of suppressed rail failures and system manipulation layers. People in control centers across Chicago stopped working entirely as the system replaced operational commands with verified memory disclosures. Ethan's posture finally broke as he realized the system was no longer responding to suppression but to irreversible acknowledgement of recorded truth. Evie stepped back slightly as the origin corridor stabilized into a single continuous memory field that no longer required correction. Jonathan watched her in silence, realizing that the system's final state was not control or release but recognition of what it had always been built around. And as the last emergency lock dissolved across the network, a new unregistered signal appeared at the edge of the system, marked only with a single designation that neither Jonathan nor Evie had ever seen before, silently activating somewhere beyond Chicago Transit Authority control, and waiting for response that no one in the corridor was prepared to understand yet, as the system held in complete rewritten equilibrium with Evie at its center. Now active, Jonathan Whitmore sat alone in the quiet aftermath inside the nearly empty command hall of what used to be Whitmore Transit headquarters in Chicago. The lights were steady now, no alarms, no warnings, only a soft hum of systems that had finally stopped fighting themselves. He exhaled slowly, as if he had forgotten how to breathe without urgency. Evie Johnson was not in front of him physically, but she was everywhere in the system, still reflected in every screen that had not yet shut down completely. He looked at one monitor and saw her standing in the origin corridor, still calm, still present, as if the station itself had decided to remember her longer than it remembered him. Jonathan leaned back into the chair, feeling something unfamiliar, not loss, not victory, but exposure of himself to something he had built without ever fully understanding why he had built it. He thought about every decision, every override, every silent approval that had led to this moment, and, for the first time, none of it felt like control. It felt like participation in something that already knew its ending. Evie's voice echoed faintly in his memory, not as command but as observation, calm, simple, unafraid. He realized she had never been asking him to save her, she had been showing him what he had refused to see about everything. He controlled the system, the city, even himself. Jonathan stood slowly and walked toward the glass wall overlooking the silent transit network below, where trains no longer moved but waited in alignment like something finally understood. He saw Evie again in reflection, not as a child or anomaly, but as the quiet center of everything that had forced him to stop pretending he was separate from what he created, and in that stillness, he understood something he had avoided for years, that control was never the same as responsibility, and responsibility without truth always collapses into silence. He turned slightly back toward the console where a single system prompt remained active, asking for final administrative confirmation regarding Evie Johnson's continued system designation, and Jonathan Whitmore placed his hand over the interface, not as an executive but as someone choosing something for the first time without needing permission or control, and paused just before pressing the final confirmation key as Evie's reflection appeared once more beside his in the glass, and he realized the decision was no longer about the system but about what kind of world he would allow her to continue in, and his finger hovered just above the button while the room waited for him to choose. Slowly and finally, as Evie watched from the reflection behind him without speaking, and the system stayed silent, as if it too was waiting for the human answer that would define everything that came next in the life of Jonathan Whitmore. He lowered his hand slightly, then stopped again, noticing Evie's quiet presence anchoring the entire decision space itself, and pressed confirm slowly. And now Jonathan Whitmore removed his executive access card from the terminal and snapped it in half, then placed it into Evie Johnson's small hand, officially removing himself as sole authority over her designation and transferring legal guardianship and personal trust authority to her name. Evie did not speak at first, only stared at the broken card in her palm, the same hand that once missed the last train on a rainy Chicago night that had started everything. Jonathan stepped back slowly from the terminal glass, realizing for the first time that ownership had never been about control but about who you are willing to belong to when control disappears. Evie looked up at him, then toward the quiet transit maps still glowing faintly in the background, and for the first time she no longer looked like someone being followed by fate but someone being recognized by it. On the floor beside them lay the crumpled ticket from the Union Station night, now unfolded on its own, as if the system itself no longer needed it to hide what it had always been pointing toward. Jonathan knelt down beside her without hesitation, not as a billionaire or architect of systems, but as a man finally understanding that the only real system that mattered was standing in front of him, breathing. "You missed your last train for me," she said quietly, "but I think it was the first time I was ever actually arriving somewhere." Jonathan did not answer, only nodded, as if accepting a truth that had been waiting since the beginning of everything he had built. The station doors in the distance slowly reopened, not to the system they once served, but to a quieter path that neither of them had seen before, glowing like a beginning instead of an ending. Evie held the ticket tighter for a moment, then placed it back into Jonathan's hand as if returning something that had always belonged to both of them, not as possession but as shared memory of everything they had survived together, since the night they first missed what was supposed to be an ending. Jonathan looked at her hand over his for a long silence that did not need words. understanding now that every system he had ever built was only a reflection of moments like this where choice replaced control and presence replaced authority. The lights of the corridor behind them softened into a steady calm, as if the entire station had finally accepted that its purpose was no longer to command but to witness what they chose next together. And for the first time since everything began, neither Evie Johnson nor Jonathan Whitmore moved as if the future was something waiting ahead, but something already being created in the quiet space between their breathing right now. Behind them, the station remained open not as an ending but as a path forward, waiting for whoever they would choose to become next in the life that was finally theirs together now. Evie Johnson stood at Union Station the next morning, watching sunlight slide across the same platform where everything had once begun. The air no longer carried alarms or emergency signals, only the ordinary rhythm of people arriving late for ordinary reasons. Jonathan Whitmore waited beside her, no longer in a tailored suit but in a simple coat he had not worn in years. He held a small coffee cup with both hands as if learning how to exist without controlling anything around him. Evie watched a train pass in silence, the same direction she once missed on a rainy night that changed everything. This time she did not move when it left, only followed it with her eyes as if saying goodbye to a version of herself. Jonathan noticed her stillness and understood it better than any system he had ever built or controlled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded transit map, not to analyze it, but to remember how lost he once was. Evie gently took the map, folded it again, and placed it back into his hand without saying anything. A quiet understanding passed between them, the kind that does not need explanation to survive. The station loudspeaker crackled once, but there were no announcements anymore, only distant echoes of what used to be instructions. Jonathan looked at Evie and realized she was no longer someone he needed to protect, but someone he needed to understand. She smiled faintly, the same soft expression she had when she first missed the last train that rainy night in Chicago. Now there was no train to miss, only a path that seemed to continue without asking permission. Jonathan exhaled slowly, and for the first time in a long time, he did not plan the next moment. Evie looked up at the station roof and whispered something so soft it was almost part of the air. Jonathan asked softly, "What did you say?" Evie shook her head and pointed toward the arriving morning light spilling through the glass ceiling. It looked like the same light from that night, but this time it stayed instead of disappearing. A train announced itself in the distance, not urgent, not final, just present. Jonathan and Evie stood together watching it approach without moving toward or away from it. It was not the last train anymore, just another one continuing a story that no longer needed to end. Jonathan quietly placed his hand beside Evie's on the railing, not touching, just close enough to stay. Evie noticed but did not move away. For a moment, everything felt ordinary again, as if extraordinary things had finally settled into memory. Jonathan looked at Evie and understood that nothing he built would ever matter more than moments like this. And Evie simply watched the train arrive as if it had always been on time in a way only she could understand. And the doors opened softly without either of them needing to speak again now together.